ready. Welcome everyone to the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs for this, at least for myself, very exciting visit and event. I'm still adjusting a bit to the hopefully post-pandemic world where we're actually able to meet and interact and meet physically, not only on the screen, as I've also been doing with our guests today quite a bit over the last couple of years, but actually to meet and discuss here. There's, of course, lots of stuff happening in the world at a very rapid pace. Today we are here to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, in particular what's happening around that massive infrastructure building and planning in light of the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, which is of course still raging in large part of the world, not least in Asia, enhanced power, competition and rivalry between major countries, and of course also changing politics within China and more restrictive regulations on many fronts. For those of you who have followed somewhat the global developments over the past few years, I don't think you have been able to skip the development of the Belt and Road Initiative, which China or Chinese leaders at least started speaking very actively about back in 2013. Of course, China has been and have been for a long time building lots of roads and projects for many, many, many years before that. But over the past decade, this Belt and Road Initiative have, of course, evolved in many ways and also included many types of additional activities. There is a health Belt and Road, there is a digital Silk Road, there is of course educational programs and lots of cultural and social events that both Chinese and collaborating countries attach to the Belt and Road label. But here today we are going to talk mostly about the physical aspects and the actual infrastructure connectivity between those different initiatives and projects. We will have a Q&A towards the end, so there will definitely be ability to ask questions. I've also been told that we need to inform you or remind everyone that the event is being streamed. So unless you want to be caught on camera or your voice is heard, you have to keep in mind that we are being distributed throughout the internet. To engage in discussion today, and we have planned this not as a big presentation or a big keynote or a long kind of lecture, but actually a dynamic conversation between people who from various angles and with various perspectives work on different sides of the Belt and Road Initiative or China's overall regional and global development plans. And I'm very, very happy to have with us here on the stage three good colleagues and people I get to know better every time we meet. First, there is, of course, Professor Chen Xiangming, who's a professor of urban studies and sociology at Trinity College, who has a very exciting background growing up in Beijing, educated both in China and moving to the US, working his way through the University of Illinois, I think at Chicago, moving to Trinity College where he is based now, and being a scholar with a Chinese background, staying in the States, researching what is connectivity programs, probably at the time in our lives where China's connectivity ambitions have been at their most ambitious ever, and of course where the rivalry and competition between different powers, not least the US and China, are as intense as ever. So I think we will have to invite you back several times to tap into more aspects of that history. And to his side is Heidi Østbøhaugen, who's a professor of Chinese studies at the University of Oslo, also has been specialized for many years of different types of connectivity or encounters between people and countries, particularly the southern parts of China and several countries in Africa. And I've been, of course, in touch with Heidi over many years, always impressed with her work. And nowadays she runs not only one, but several large projects from the Research Council of Norway and the European Research Councils. And she's able to balance that with a very active publication list and also very active program with lots of activities where also people like myself and you here also will be able to join and follow. And then last but not least is, of course, our own Ren Jenny Lindgren, who's a senior researcher here at NUPI, who is strongly focused on Asia, with a particularly strong focus on Japanese foreign policy, but also a very active research into several other countries, and also how other countries in the East and Southeast Asia region both react to Chinese and other major regional powers kind of initiatives and investments. And she's also very active in the Belt and Road related projects, Roads to Power, the political effects of infrastructure projects in Asia, which of course is run here from Asia with Research Council of Norway founding. Then, to start off our conversation, I plan to have a few initial questions for each of you, and I would say it's fair to say that I planned the most extensive questions for Professor Chen, who is here visiting. We will go into, of course, very quickly what is happening to the Belt and Road in light of the pandemic and the war and other major world developments. But to kind of start off, I wanted us to go back a little bit, back in time, and to ask for your reflection on how you saw the Belt and Road initially, how big, how specific, how important it looked when we saw the kind of initial plans, at least in terms of Belt and Road terminology, getting more popular 10 years back.
Well, first of all, Hans, thank you, and thanks to NUPI for hosting this wonderful event. And it's great to be here with both Heidi and Ren as well to talk about the Belt Road Initiative, or BRI for short, which really has, in a relatively short period of time, say 8 years plus, become really a defining feature for the global economy and global geopolitics. And if we think to a European audience, and I think a global audience, I think there's a couple very basic starting points that I like to make. Assuming that, most people have become aware of the BRI is a infrastructure-oriented, connectivity-oriented initiative. But I think it's very important to recognize that this is one country, China, initiated global project. And then there are really two very basic terms that a scholar has used, Ming Ye, a political scientist, that I would appropriate to highlight two really salient features. One is ambition. And this is a globally ambitious project in terms of the geographic sweeping scope of the project. And of course, the belt, as we know, is the Silk Road economic belt that extends from deep inside China across the Eurasia continent and all the way to, I would say, the heart of Europe. The road, of course, winds its way from Southeast China coast through South China Sea, Indian Ocean, into the Gulf, and then, of course, touching Eastern Africa. But I think if you look beyond the Belt and Road themselves, and I think you see another set of transnational transporter economic corridors. There are 6 of them. They're labeled differently. And these 6 corridors, of course, also originate from China and extending toward Europe, west and also south to Southeast Asia. So if you add all these geographic territorial spaces and their boundaries, it is truly a globally ambitious and historically unprecedented round of spatial geographic connectivity and integration. So that's the ambitious part, right? And then there's also the ambiguous part, because these growth corridors don't have very clear boundaries. And the BRI itself, at least the Chinese government officially claims now has 149 countries that have either signed some kind of agreement to work with China. And on the other hand, there's also the regularly, repeatedly reported Belt Road countries, and there are 60 plus countries that are geographically located along the belt, over land, and the road, along the sea. And so again, so the ambiguous part is also very interesting because it, on the one hand, accounts for a very large swath of the world in terms of population, over 40%, GDP, 35% also, and global trade between 35% to 40%. So it's globally significant. But at the same time, I would end on this characterization on the ambiguity because it also become very localized. So as these regional corridors take shape and touching a variety of places, many of them are relatively remote and marginal. And we're seeing the connectivities not only from China to the world and come back. Some Western critics would say all roads would be leading to China. You're actually seeing many roads and bridges and rails actually connecting countries that had nothing to do geographically with China, not connected. So we're also should be really thinking about the Belt Road. It's a geographically fragmented initiative that involves all of these countries at the subnational level and the local level. And these infrastructure projects matter a lot to the cities and their hinterlands and the regions where the projects have actually materialized and constructed and become operational. I think that I wanted to get that initial kind of coexisting, juxtaposed images of ambition and ambiguity, and that, I think, sets up a good way of talking about all the complexities, the opportunities on the one hand, and the challenges and the obstacles for implementation, and thinking, assessing its benefits on the other.
Very good, insightful start. If we pick up a bit on the ambiguity part and localization parts, I think there's many, at least from the outside, expect or envision the Belt and Road as part of a very carefully structured plan, or a very kind of clear envision of a map of the world with very clear tracks and roads and belts. You've already been talking a bit about it, but could you elaborate a bit from your perspective to the extent that it's actually kind of a well-planned investment and infrastructure plan, or is actually something that actively, dynamically evolves as the years go by and the various projects materialize or not?
Well, that's really the critical question, right? It's from looking its origin and starting position and the ideas that are leading up to it. So Belt Road didn't come out of a vacuum in 2013 when it was announced. There were earlier processes, dynamics that really set up the premise and the background and the planning, if you will. But those kinds of earlier developments were very much China-based. So they happened within China. And I will point out two such dynamics. One is the Great Western Development, or if you will, China's second geographic infrastructure turn away from the coastal cities that really developed earlier and faster and toward the western regions of China as a way of rebalancing the growing regional disparities between the coast and the interior and the border regions. And of course, around late 90s, 2000, the second domestically initiated perspective that also later fed into the BRI will be go global. So go west and go global. Those two things, I think, helped prepare China to launch the BRI in response to a set of domestic economic challenges or even crisis, because it was the long recovery from the global financial crisis, overproduction, overcapacity, lack of new markets globally, for China to export its endless amount of consumer products and labor-intensive products, and even moving up the global supply chains. So China was looking for new markets, and that's why I think the infrastructure connectivity that really was very integral for China to expand its export outlets. So from that point of view, was a very strong, heavy dose of planning, top-down from the national level, but very quickly, that early planning and vision became a much more complex and fragmented set of implementation strategies that began to involve more subnational actors, provincial, local governments, and commercial actors, state-owned companies, and private companies. So we had mobilization from the top, from policy directives, economic resources, but the actual coordination, the actual orchestration of the BRI has become much more a complex and sometimes contradictory, conflated, and stop and go, uncertain, I would say maybe the best word will be fragmented landscape of implementation. So there are numerous points of initiatives from the bottom that began to add up, to some larger effects that partially reflect the original vision, but also reflecting, as you said, the dynamic evolution, adaptation, adjustments along the way. If you look at the amount of investment, the momentum, obviously from 2013, the overall investment number of projects peaked at around 2016, 2017, right? After the first BRI forum. But then very quickly, you have a couple years of some kind of consolidation and adjustment. So when the second BRI forum was held in 2019, some scholars were already talking about BRI 2.0. And so you have adjustments and adaptations to scaling back on some of the size of the loans, and also become more selective. Also, more countries were added to the BRI. So in some ways, you could say that the much larger number of countries that were added subsequent to the original 60-plus countries further complicated and fragmented the implementation process.
I'm going to ask a very simple, but I think impossible question to answer in any simple terms. But if we try to simplify a bit and consider how much has actually been built and how much of the kind of Belt and Road related projects we've actually seen materializing, if we try to limit it to around 10 years, how different is the map of infrastructure today compared to 10 years ago, in ways that at least from Chinese planners that would like to connect to the Belt and Road plans?
Maybe a simple question, but very difficult and complex almost impossible to answer for a variety of reasons. So I'll do my best, try to at least shed some light, clarity on the scope and the size, the numbers, the projects. There's a variety of estimates, by different analysts, but I would say that the consistent part of the overall scope and the overall number of completed projects, maybe around 2,000, but these are projects of certain size. And some estimates put about between 500 billion to about $1 trillion attached to these about 2,000 projects. Not all of these projects obviously were completely completed and operational, and some are ongoing. And some push that number forward and just say maybe in another few years, those 2,000 major BRI projects will be sort of finalized and materialized. But if you break those numbers down that we're seeing, most of these projects are really dominated by two sectors, which is energy and transportation. And then everything else was much more less significant. But I think there was a couple critical time points here, right? Since 2019, as I said earlier in response to your previous question, that we run into the pandemic. And of course, for BRI, it was a big setback. And of course, then between 19 and 21, for the last couple years, for which we have some information, then we're seeing a steady drop in the amount of investment, in the number of new projects initiated, and in the scale of the projects. That, we're thinking about capitalization, right? The amount of capital per project has also decreased. Some analysts estimate about 40% decrease between 20 and 21, and in addition to the initial decline from 2019 to 2020. But on the other hand, I would finish my response by also highlighting the pandemic also has created other new opportunities for the BRI to make the kind more rational, more adaptive adjustments. Well, you mentioned about the health Silk Road earlier. I think the pandemic has given China a room or opportunity to actually shift and some resources toward the health sector by quickly building up, some hospitals, for example, in Ethiopia, in dealing with the pandemic, and also began a very ambitious international co-production initiative for the vaccines. So very soon, there's still somewhat unofficial, there will be a number of announcements coming. China is working very hard on its own mRNA vaccine and is doing it with a number of countries. So about, I would say almost 20 countries that are collaborating with China in terms of local vaccine co-production. And again, these countries are very strong BRI countries. So China is obviously very selective in choosing these countries to work on that. So I would say on the one hand, we have a contraction, a shrinking of the large-scale, massive-scale projects. But at the same time, some of these projects, among the 2,000, what China calls the flagship project, had also been completed and became operational. So that means that there will be no longer the need to continue putting a lot of money into the new projects because they will be smaller and less capital intensive. The other difficulty of counting and estimating the projects are some of these projects are involving investment for exchange for goods and services. And China would provide the financing for the projects, but in fact, the money, the loan that's dispersed never really leave China. What China gets back, maybe oil from Angola, for example, or maybe copper and other minerals from DRC in Africa. So that also complicates the exact estimation. In addition, some of these projects involve renminbi, the Chinese currency, and it's not freely convertible with dollars or euros. So when you actually do the conversion back, and that also affects the actual precise numbers.
Thank you. We'll come back and talk lots more about effects of the pandemic and the war. But before that, we'll move on to Heidi. You have, of course, for many years now been following closely both people and economic activities and other types of connections or encounters between people in the, particularly the south of China, but I'm sure it reaches all over China and into several African countries. How important is the types of infrastructure projects that we typically think of when we mention Belt and Roads?
Well, infrastructure is important to all Africans, of course, like it is to us. It's just that we don't think about it because it works, right? So if you ask, yeah, so if you ask a Nigerian what you need the most, very often the answer will be light, so electricity. And then second would often be road, if not health and education. So these are projects that impact people's lives and that have the potential to improve people's livelihoods, the potential, right? And that is particularly the case when they, as Chen Xiangming mentioned, support existing regional systems that are already working but that could benefit from enhanced transportation routes. So an example would be the Belt and Road Initiative. Now to build a railway between Lagos and Calabar, so along the coast in Nigeria, which is an economic axis already, and the one that they have in the plans to build from Lagos to Kano, so going north, which is also an existing economic axis. Well, both of these projects have been put on hold, and that's also a moment where you see really who has an interest in these and what are their significance. And the reasons they've been put on hold is what Chen Xiangming alluded to, the dry up of funds from China and the shift away from large-scale projects with one entrepreneur towards a more public-private partnerships and a more fragmented financing structure. But for railways, you do need to have a large chunk of money available, and you do need to have a very long plan. Again, as we know in Norway, it's a very hard thing to actually realize. So what they're doing now in Nigeria is to look towards the African Development Bank, towards European funders, towards public-private partnerships. So I think the Belt and Road was important in putting infrastructure on the agenda. And even as it is rolled back, it will have lasting effects in that it has set things in motion that now have taken on a life on its own.
All right, thank you. If some of the projects and the bigger railroads that you have mentioned, it's obvious that seen from China or when talking to Chinese planners, it would obviously be framed and termed in like Belt and Road terms. But amongst your African informants or sources or people you deal with, are we still speaking very actively about Belt and Road projects, for instance, in Nigeria, or is it more train or energy projects that happen to come with some China-related finances?
I think the Belt and Road is not a very strong brand in West Africa, where I work. So, but people are very quick to pick up the words that have caught on politically, also to justify their own opinions. So I was in Ghana earlier this year, where a lot of traders are suffering because China's borders have been closed. They can no longer go to China to source goods. Same for students who had, have now for 2.5 years had their degree studies in China interrupted because of the border closure. And they have picked up on, for example, the term friendship, that China and Ghana, we should be friends, and which is a trope in Chinese foreign policy that's been used since Mao's times, right? Or even this familiar relationship, like we shouldn't be distanced. It's not natural for people who are of the same family, brothers and sisters like Ghana and China, to be distant. So certainly if there's, people will appropriate this term for their own agenda.
We'll return to that too, but first, Ren, you have studied and are studying, of course, how countries and powers in the region respond to different types of initiatives, whether it is from China and from other countries. What have been major responses to the Belt and Road, either if you talk about it as the initiative or the plan or the slogan or the physical material project that we have seen evolving?
Yeah, so I think there have actually been a number of responses, or some would also term them as alternatives, particularly in the Asian region. If we divide into Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, if we look at some of the major economies in Northeast Asia, particularly Japan, we see quite prominent alternatives to the BRI, and some would actually, term these as counter strategies to the BRI. So in a way, these are responses to the BRI at a more formalized level, but there have also been informal conversations. So in the case of Japan, actually, the formalized initiative is called the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision Strategy Concept. They keep changing it. This is something that was launched in 2016 by former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and has really become an important, broadly reaching geographic initiative on the part of the Japanese government, but has also instigated other FOIPs from the United States government, from Australia. We are even hearing that Canada will consider making their own FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific Policy. And this is important, I think, because in many ways the FOIP shares a lot with the BRI in terms of its geographic span, right? It's trying to connect the Indian Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean, but also the focus that it puts on very important prominent initiatives that have been long-standing in Japanese foreign policy related to infrastructure development, specifically quality infrastructure development, right? So that word quality is really key in the sense that there is an initiative to try to keep the infrastructure open, to keep the transparency around the funding around the infrastructure, to make sure that there are not debt traps involved with infrastructure. So many of the language that we hear in the response in the Free and Open Indo-Pacific could be termed as also counter strategies to how many have understood how the BRI has played out. So that's really in the Northeast Asian perspective. And an important part of this, of course, is where this FOIP on Japan's part is geographically focused. And the hub and heart of this is in ASEAN, in this, 10 economies of Southeast Asia. And this is not dissimilar to, I would say, the BRI, where the ASEAN has been an important hub both historically and since the launching of the BRI in 2013. But we do see different approaches, different corridors that Japan proposes, different lateral or vertical arrangements and how they organize their infrastructure development. In some cases, you could say that it is a complementary thing. In others, you could say it is a competitive element. But I think also it's important to take into account, of course, the responses of the Southeast Asian countries, right? And those have been, as Professor Chen pointed out, varied over time as we've seen the development of the BRI projects, the potential challenges with financing them, with actually implementing them, with building them, some of the outcomes. So we see that there's a constant challenge to evaluate the social, environmental, political, economical viability of the projects that are being pitched. And of course, as the other responses or alternatives come up from the US, from Japan, from potentially the G7, we see that there is a broader range on the menu for Southeast Asian nations, so they may be perhaps not as quick to join on to BRI projects. But I think also it's important to think about some of the mega projects that have actually finalized to some degree recently, and Professor Chen had mentioned this as well, as we see, the projects that have actually been able to make it through these years of construction. Most recently, we saw the China-Lao Railway that was released in December 2021 and is now functioning. a very expensive project. I think it was estimated around $6 billion US. 70% of the rail is owned by China. But this was a project that went among many years and now is in activity. How we can really evaluate whether or not this is a viable project commercially is something that we will see in the coming years. So, I think when it comes to the BRI projects and potentially also to many of the FOIA projects, it's difficult to evaluate them at this point. Time will tell. And this, of course, will influence how decisions are made in the future in Southeast Asia about whether they want to choose BRI potential projects, FOIA projects, other alternatives that are also in the works. We just have another new acronym last week, but I'll share that in a bit maybe.
That's why we're here, to keep researching and evaluating, right? Otherwise, we would be out of business. But one kind of follow-up question. You mentioned quite a bit about the Japanese initiatives. We have seen various forms from U.S. initiatives with various presidents in charge. There is a G7, which is a very U.S.-inspired version of the Build Back Better world. Does any of these so-called alternatives compare or even come close, like in size and ambition, when you compare it to the kind of, at least the types of projects that we normally think of in terms of belonging to the BRI in some way?
Yes, that's a great question. I think that is something that many analysts are now really trying to consider. The challenge is many of these newer acronyms in the alphabet soup of alternatives have not actually really come into practice yet, right? They've been introduced, they have been launched to some degree, but the actual content of the initiatives have not played out yet. And again, this is a little bit challenging because like FOIP, like BRI, many of the initiatives within these newer alternatives are not necessarily new policies, right? It's more conglomeration, it's more policies that have more geographical breadth, perhaps, and again, emphasizing, of course, the infrastructure, the connectivity, and the people-to-people aspect. But I think if we were to really consider some of the more prominent policies, I would, again, refer to the free and open Indo-Pacific, and not just specifically to Japan's, but also to the similar arrangements that the United States and other countries are coming together. And what's interesting here is, it's not just a standalone policy. The free and open Indo-Pacific policies are very linked to the Quad, right, which is the security arrangement between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, and also they're linked to many of these G7 initiatives like the Bring Back Better World, right? So the potential for all of these different alternatives to really come into being together and be something that would seriously challenge the BRI, I think is there. But it's a matter of launching them and a matter of making sure that both the domestic-driven policies and the multilateral-driven policies are coherent and able to really benefit from each other instead of, overlapping or potentially, potentially not being organized enough to make the proper implementation that could have in consequences for the BRI projects.
You want to join?
Sure.
Yes.
I think this is a very, I would say, connective, transitional bridging issue, right? To talk about the comparative advantages and disadvantages, from these different initiatives, especially the ones initiated by the West and Japan in response to BRI, which really should sensitize us to think about the key differences and some similarities. And so I would maybe just quickly highlight three key differences that seemingly would position China, more competitively, at least for now, and maybe into the short future, especially in response to FOIP, and it is geographic. I would say the first one, right? So China borders Southeast Asia, a long borderline, with three countries, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, and has geographic proximity to others, but with also ocean connectivity that's a fairly relatively close in comparison to Japan. So I think is apropos mentioning of China-Laos Railway, or Lost China Railway from the Lao perspective, it's really the most compelling example, most recent example that illustrates the advantage on the Chinese side for connecting, creating a major transport artery across the border to allow, quick, efficient physical access for both Chinese economy to export to ASEAN, but also obviously for landlocked Laos to have access to sea, and then further connection to what Thailand is trying to build, the high-speed railway going north to dock with China-Laos Railway. So geographic proximity, China, it's more convenient and easier to do. The second, I would say, would be financing. These newer initiatives originating from the West, very recent, and I would say, they're at least 8 years behind China. So China has already accumulated lots of completed projects, are finishing other projects. So it has already accumulated lots of demonstration effects and projecting that demonstration effect to different countries. Here's what we built and how well they're working, or not so very well they're working. So lessons learned and implications identified. But I would say also, I think, use, our common phrase, right? If you have new initiatives, are you going to put your money where your mouth is? And so that's where I think these other initiatives are lagging behind. The Global Gateway, has mentioned several $100 billion, but it's over, a long time frame, and China has already committed literally that amount of money. And that's already been in completed projects. The last and third advantage, right? So the first is geographic, second financing capacity. The third, I would say, is the combination of financing and also the quality of the delivered infrastructure products. So China has been able to draw a lot from experience and expertise and engineering capacity from building up a tremendous, the largest amount of infrastructure in the world over 40 years. And now is actually leveraging and extending that expertise and that experience to other countries. And for example, in direct competition with Japan, I'm building high-speed rail in Indonesia, right? The 140-kilometer high-speed train between Bandung and Jakarta. And obviously China, outcompeted Japan, even though Japan had better technology, but China is now competing on the combination of lower price and equally good, maybe in some ways slightly inferior, maybe in some of the most advanced technology, but really fitting technology, appropriate kind of infrastructure for the hosting countries, the global south conditions, right? China-Laos railways, again, example, China have adjusted a high-speed train to medium speed, and that would work very well for Laos because you have very difficult geographic terrains, and so you don't need to run that fast. And so those three things combined, I would say, least favors BRI for now in head-to-head competition. But I think more important in the longer run, I would also share Rand's hope that they will become more complementary, collaborative, connected, as opposed to be presented as competition. So that makes it very hard for global South countries to really, they have to pick and choose.
Could we elaborate a bit on that, maybe focusing on Asia for a bit? Heidi mentioned that the agenda setting, the infrastructure up on the agenda setting effect of Belt and Road. We could talk about Belt and Roads in terms of inspiring other countries to build, inspiring other countries to invest and respond, but also, as now you're saying, competing. Many infrastructure projects are a very physical thing. It's a railroad, it's a road. You either put a train on it or you put a car on it or not. Isn't it by design almost kind of defined to be overlapping and supplementing plans or projects? Or do we actually see the competition or the competitive responses to a way that you actually offer solutions that are not compatible with the other. Any of you?
Okay,
Yeah.
I can begin then
Well,
a little
yeah,
bit
so
on that. Yeah, so
if you understood my question.
I did
Yeah.
understand your question. Yeah, and this is something that I have actually encountered a few times in the fieldwork that I've done in Myanmar, where I've been looking at the Japanese initiatives in Myanmar versus the Chinese Belt and Road. This was, of course, prior to the coup in February 2021, so I think the landscape is a bit different now, but this is a concern that was brought up in many of my interviews and conversations, right? The fact that we are perhaps building infrastructure that, I mean, first and foremost, maybe is not the most essential infrastructure that is needed when you're building maybe a major highway, when really what you need is a very simple bridge to cross two roads together, but also the fact that, as I mentioned before, because of the types of corridors that are involved with the BRI and also the way that Japan has traditionally made its infrastructure in Southeast Asia, often you find different kind of patterns and regions. So I think in the Chinese case, right, the Chinese-Myanmar economic corridor is kind of going like this. It's reaching over to the Yunnan province of China, again, bringing in the activity from Myanmar into China, also providing the option of not relying on maritime routes that could potentially become unstable. Whereas the Japanese focus is very much located in specific areas, and I would say more latitude-based, also historically, right, because Japan sees Myanmar as a gateway onto the further Pacific, Indo-Pacific through India. And so we see, I mean, complementary projects in some regards in the fact that they're covering both spectrums of the geographic breadth, but we also see challenges when it comes to what the projects actually are, how they are bid on, how successful bids are managed, for instance. And so I think one of the interesting observations that I had that I'm sure that Professor Chen can elaborate on, since he's really an expert in this area, is on the special economic zones that are being implemented in Myanmar. And in the case of Japan, the Tilawa Special Economic Zone, it is the largest and most successful in the country. It is a joint initiative between the Japanese government and Myanmar, and what we see there is an economic zone that is not so far removed from the capital of Yangon, but we see a number of international companies located in this economic zone, and we see a lot of infrastructure building on the part of Japan around this economic zone to make sure that the accessibility to the economic zone is something not only for these international companies, but also for the local employees. It's an initiative to engage the labor force in Myanmar as well. And so I think, you know, in part, we do have a complementary structure, and again, when it comes to Japan's take on the BRI, it is not opposed to the BRI. In fact, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, former Prime Minister in 2017, was very clear that he is not opposed to the BRI, but he thinks that there are certain values, particularly related to transparency, environmental sustainability, financing, that need to be very hashed out in the agreements that are made, and that Japan would potentially collaborate with China on projects where this is possible. This is something that has been said, but in reality there is no collaboration on the ground related to these mega projects. So again, I think there is a sense of collaboration, there is a sense of competition, but also the regional focus of these different initiatives, the BRI focusing, of course, very close to the Chinese border and the access to the Chinese mainland is an important point from making these countries being more landlocked to land-linked. And China is, of course, promoting this not just in Myanmar, but as we talked about in the case of Laos, this was a very important point for that railroad, but also the connectivity onto Thailand, right, to make it even more commercially viable. And that's where I think we will see more interactions also with Japanese infrastructure projects that could be more on the competition side of the game.
Okay. Now let's spend some time on the state of the world and how the various crises or developments that we're in the midst of have been and are affecting the Belt and Road initiatives and associated plans and projects. And there is, of course, the COVID pandemic, which we have hopefully for a lasting move beyond, or mostly beyond, in in Europe, which is still, of course, creating havocs and lots of has lots of effects still in Asia, not least in China, where we have seen major cities just opening up after a new lockdown in recent days. There's a war in Ukraine, which is, of course, situated in an area that is very essential to very large Belt and Roads initiatives and plans. There is a sharpened geopolitical competition or even rivalry between some countries, and I would say it's a general sense of more tense or even conflictual relations between many countries, also between European countries and China. And there is, of course, a set of restrictive and kind of stronger or stricter regulations on the Chinese side, which Xiangming has already spoken a bit about, with restricting kind of regulations around financing and planning and risk assessments and so forth, which of course has implications also for, or at least potential implications for many Belt and Road plans that many people have been hoping to see materialize. So I'm sure we could mention other huge, big, impactful world events, but if we consider these kinds of overall, first of all, which is of course an impossible question to answer again, and that's why I'm asking, is it possible to disentangle these a bit and spend a few words, spend some time like considering which of these kind of world developments that have the most implications for the Belt and Road planning and the materialization of projects. So maybe start with Heidi.
Sure. Well, one thing that's common to many of the crises you mentioned is that it poses a risk to the tens of thousands of Chinese engineers, managers, workers who are out working to realize the Belt and Road projects. So along with all the investments that you've been talking about, there's also been a huge flow of people that can enable the project to be realized. And expectations among these workers have really changed over the past or since 2013 and a little bit before that as well, as to what China can offer them in terms of protection and in terms of services. So when I, in 2001, 2002, interviewed Chinese migrants in West Africa, they were very they didn't have much faith in what the Chinese government could do for them, except renewing their passport, perhaps. Whereas with these large investments, there's much greater need and demand for state support for all kinds of things, including for making sure that the citizens are safe when they're abroad. And the lifting of Chinese citizens out of the Yemen crisis proved that the Chinese government does have the capacity now that they didn't have before to evacuate huge numbers of people who are abroad. Then the COVID crisis, of course, is of a very different nature. But there again, we saw that there was a priority in the Chinese government to ensure the safety of its citizens abroad and to communicate that very strongly to companies. So vaccines were made available first, I would say, at a very, very early stage to Chinese citizens who were traveling abroad, with the justification internally that these are more exposed because there was very little COVID in China then, but also as a way of saying we have your back. That you can still, we're committed to have these projects going on despite the pandemic. So those expectations that the Chinese government has set up for how it can protect its citizens abroad are going to be very hard to deliver on. And the Ukraine crisis showed us exactly that. That despite its enormous capacity, it is very hard to protect your citizens all around the world, and especially when you have citizens both in Russia and a large population in Ukraine. And we saw that the Chinese government fell short of being able to protect its citizens in Ukraine, and it didn't have any catastrophical results, but it would make you be more realistic, perhaps, about how far the government will go into other countries to make sure that those who realize the projects are taken care of.
All right, so about keeping people and plants, if not safe, then at least not in the crossfire of harmful events. Xiangming, you were very good in the beginning answering the impossible question of simplifying how much I've been building. From your point of view, looking at these very, very disruptive and large-scale developments that we see worldwide, how would you kind of disentangle not necessarily the effect of each, but the importance of each maybe on potentially changing the course of at least some of the larger Belt and Road projects or plans?
Like the impossible questions, we can avoid them or dodge them by going off on different tangents. But I really like what Heidi has started in responding to this question about, the different impacts spatially and organizationally, and of course in terms of economic benefits versus losses. I would say the double crises of the pandemic and followed by the war, I think has illustrated, again, some unusually strong capacity of the Chinese state, or the Chinese government, to respond, and also has exposed some of the challenges that would be almost impossible to overcome, regardless of the type of governments under local circumstances. I think if you're thinking about the very strong organized effort to vaccinate overseas Chinese workers, the 春苗计划, right, the spring seedling plan. And I have done some careful reading about how they delivered that to the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and very carefully orchestrated and organized, surgically implemented. And in fact, if you actually dig a little deeper, what you find is not only the Chinese workers on site who got the 2 shots very quickly, but the Chinese team also expanded the vaccination plan to the nearby villages. And you can say, well, maybe that's a state smart strategy, in terms of creating, the friendship idea, because Hambantota is a very controversial project. It's really the most controversial one in terms of death trap. So I think China has integrated the effort to vaccinate its own workers and staff, would also try to extend that effort into the nearby local population. So that's an interesting illustration. But on the other hand, I think the other very high-level, larger-scale illustration of how China responded to both the pandemic and the war is actually on the backs of the earlier progress of the BRI, which helped China and Europe and also Central Asian countries to have forged a large transcontinental rail freight system that allowed China or Chinese government and also some Chinese companies to actually bypass and avoid the time-consuming but also pandemic-enabled suspension of sea shipping by going overland using the trains, from different interior cities in China to send large amount of PPE to Europe, particularly to Italy, the first country that was the epicenter, and then Germany. And of course, China had a very strong capacity to quickly mobilize the production of the PPE, and the trains really helped bring them over to Europe. But now the second back-to-back illustration of that would be also the, I guess, somewhat unanticipated negative effect of the war, but also illustrates some flexibility in the capacity of responding to that crisis. Again, is how the suspension of the rail routes through Russia, through Belarus, and Ukraine were suspended after the war, but how the system adapted by creating some efforts, making the coordinated efforts by rerouting some of the trains, avoiding Russia, so going directly from China or Western China to Kazakhstan, to the Caspian Sea, to Atoll port, and then cross the Caspian Sea to Baku of Azerbaijan, and then going further west into Georgia, Tbilisi, and then entering Turkey, from the north, in the small city of Kars, actually a very small Asian Silk Road city. So again, the old and present connection, and then from there going further west from Ankara to Istanbul, and then passing the strait into Europe. So I think what we're seeing is that the earlier work, the earlier economic accomplishment, BRI, actually has turned out to have created a system or a mechanism that allow certain kind of adjustments in response to the subsequent later unanticipated, largely war and invasion of Ukraine. And so I would say that those examples are very good illustrations of both the negative impact of the crisis, but also the adaptive responses that may bode well, for the long run. That if you can work across borders in coordinated fashions, that you can actually help mitigate some of the crisis. And again, the challenge for, I think, Heidi, from an African perspective, the food crisis, right? When the Ukraine ports were shut down, millions tons of food cannot be exported. And China is actually paying a big price. It's suffering a lot because China built up Mariupol port, Odessa port, actually has constructed subways in Kiev, in Kharkiv, and China is losing billions and billions of dollars. It's very friendly with Ukraine and Russia on both sides. So China, again, is caught in the middle. So I'll bring my work back about, this dilemma, right? Ambiguity of this whole massive global thing. There are so many layers of contradictions between the geopolitical conflict and then the geoeconomic, regional, localized opportunities that multiple parties have benefited from, but when a crisis strikes, and then it exposes, some larger structural geopolitical barriers to how these realized economic benefits can be sustained.
So, to sum up a bit, the way I understand your perspective is that there are lots of obvious effects and lots of obvious complications, but it also demonstrates the possibilities of making alternative routes and making alternative avenues because of everything that has actually been built and opened over the last few years. If we pick up a bit on the activity when it comes to trade and goods and people transportation, if we consider like the height right before the pandemic, and what is the situation now? Again, a very broad and big question about very big numbers. But do you have a sense, Xiangming, on how much of the transportation activity that has kind of picked up to somewhere closer to what it used to be, and or possible changes that we have seen in the kind of trade traffic over the last few years?
Well, I would say, it's a mixed picture, right? I think you have some rebound of investment, globally speaking, from the West to the developing countries and between the advanced economies, in contrast to the decline or decrease in the BRI investment, but largely reflects what we talked about earlier of the scaling down, the right sizing of the projects. But I would say in terms of overall comparative trade volumes, China obviously have privileged the BRI countries over the non-BRI countries. So that has, recovered as China recovered, but more recently, again, taking a hit. So I would say, look, going forward, I think we're going to see a continued stabilization and continued implementation of the BRI. The scope will still be relatively large, but we're going to see more finer, more timely adjustments. But the largest, most expensive project that Ran mentioned earlier, China Lost Railway, 6 billion, Tanzania, Nairobi, Mombasa project, 5 billion, Addis Ababa, Djibouti, 4.9 billion. Those projects, the era of those kind of billion worth project are gone. I think we're going to see is more getting back to what Heidi talked about, the smaller, shorter railroads within countries. China now is helping build a shorter railroad between the Lake Victoria and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. So projects in the hundreds of millions will be more likely to be more common now. And so that's, I think, in the long run, I think good for everybody and less wasteful investment, less challenges, less maybe backlashes at the local level. So I would end on this way of thinking about, if BRI exemplifies, this kind of geoeconomic statecraft that China has managed to implement, I think what we're seeing is a loop that starts from a very powerful state-driven mobilization, but through a very difficult, fragmented process of implementation. And now I think we're coming to the point where we're going to see a lot of consolidation, both on the Chinese side and also, I think, more stronger agency, stronger, challenges, from the hosting and stakeholding companies in terms of pressuring China, to renegotiate, like Malaysia, as an example, and certain projects will never be starting again. But other projects, smaller projects, will be more common and easier to complete. So I think that's what I'm seeing is sort of the scenario most likely to play out.
A follow-up question. I'll finish my questioning and then open the floor to others to ask a few things you might be wondering about very, very soon. But to end off, to the extent that all three of you, of course, Xiangming agrees with himself, but the times for these big splash mega projects might be over. Is it mostly explained by the changing conditions for those types of projects having changed so much that it's no longer feasible? Or is it also actually to some extent a condition of the need for those types of mega projects are no longer as present? So that you can see that from the countries that you work on and Ren in Asia and of course Xiangming all over.
If doing a cost-benefit analysis, probably those mega projects weren't the best choice to begin with. So it's more to take that in and act on it. But I think it's as much also a reflection of there's just less money to go out from China now. We know that China is going through some difficult economic times. And that also affects not only the money available, but also people's attitudes towards this money. So if people in China see that things are scaled back heavily at home, yet they're building these highly visible projects abroad, it's it's hard to square those things, right? So that's one thing. But with the smaller projects that Xiangming mentioned, that's going to go on. But there are also, even with the mega projects, those who go to different countries and have a contract on the mega projects often stay on and compete for local contracts afterwards, or they start a whole other business. And here there's another hard limit, which is the travel restrictions into and out of China. That before, it was much more attractive to foresee a life where you tried your luck outside as well. You could travel back once or twice a year and keep track of things both on the Chinese side and the foreign side, and this made it possible for smaller entrepreneurs to run projects. That's just much harder now for Chinese entrepreneurs, and same for African entrepreneurs with collaborators in China. So as long as there are travel restrictions, I don't think we will see a huge upsurge in the smaller projects either, because when people cannot travel, money will not travel, and goods will not travel as much.
Bren, any thoughts on the big spending days over and reasons why?
Indeed. I think a lot of actually what Heidi just mentioned resonates also if we're to look at Japan as a case, especially when considering, domestic challenges on an economic level, new initiatives for a new capitalism in Japan, and I think more skepticism about very large mega projects and infrastructure development projects being initiated now in Southeast Asia. And I think, one of the topics that has come up a few times in our conversation was this bid for the railroad in Indonesia that Japan eventually lost to China. Again, the railroad, the beginning of construction of it has been very challenged, so it is by no means finished yet. And again, I think a lot of these mega projects' success we won't know about for many years. And the connectivity to other mega or mid-sized projects is essential for many of the successes of the railroads. But just in the case of Japan, an interesting point is I think we'll see potentially an argument for more subway-related projects. And again, whether or not you would consider that a mega project or not, I think is depending on who you ask. But there has been success when it comes to developing intercity subway, and I think that is an export that Japan is very, competent and experienced in. And so I think we may see that as a potential venue taking over these bigger HSR, high-speed railway competitions. But again, as Heidi also brought up, this challenge of having these smaller private companies that have been very encouraged from the Japanese External Trade Organization to get more involved in Southeast Asia, to have the people-to-people presence on the ground, to really integrate their businesses. The challenges of the pandemic have made that really not possible, and many of Japanese companies have had to pull out their presence or limit it to some degree. And so whether or not there will be the same momentum to return to these projects in Southeast Asia and Africa and in the broader Indo-Pacific region that Japan is focusing on, is difficult to say right now. I'm a bit skeptical about that, especially considering the challenges domestically at home on an economic level and the risk-averse nature of many Japanese businesses.
Any last points? Sure. Any questions from you guys? There is one here and there, and I'll take a few. I think you can start with a mic there, and then take note of you.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Xiangming. Is that correct?
Good enough.
That would be him.
Good enough. That's good. What climate and environmental consequences, related consequences, do you think Chinese leadership consider with regards to BRI, especially in cooperation or maybe without so much cooperation with hosting countries on the BRI list? Thank you.
We can take a couple of questions and then respond. And there's a question here.
I have a question about transport infrastructure. That's part of your supply chain. That having been the case, was there ever a plan that the transport infrastructure would become if not profitable, but economically viable in order to support supply chains in different areas of where you actually built your transport infrastructure. It doesn't seem like it seemed like it was a strategy, but really no plan as to your end game as to making it profitable.
Maybe I answer those two first, and then we'll move on.
Very quickly, using two examples to answer both questions. Again, so important, so timely a question about climate change. So I think the example that illustrates, China's reaction, adaptation, response to the climate change crisis under the BRI would be the recent decision by Xi Jinping, of course, top down, to not finance any more coal-powered plants. So when you look at the charts, break down the different types of energy projects, power projects, and then you will see literally in 2020 into 2021, no more power plants. So basically that data point just sharply stopped. And then you have continued efforts, projects in oil, in gas, in solar, and in hydro. So that's the illustration. There are other examples, but I would say maybe that's the most obvious and compelling. But on the supply chain, on the compatibility, integration between supply chains and larger scale transport projects, again, there are different examples that illustrate the challenges and the lack of full coordination, because you have individual companies that are developing their own global or regional supply chain structures, right? Chinese companies investing in Europe by creating a factory, but then, now benefiting from the recently opened train route. I think I give this example, I think maybe with Heidi on the meeting. There's a company in southern China, in Huizhou, near Shenzhen, the first special economic zone, TCL, that makes large number of television stations for the East European markets. So they set up a factory in Poland, in a small city, in the eastern part of Poland. And that just happens to be very close to a train line that coming from China, through Russia, through Belarus, then into Poland. So now that company is able to use that train route to ship its parts and components to organize just-in-time production. So it allows, its local workers in Poland, to be on schedule, because the part, but better control on when the parts components arrive, much faster, as opposed to be 45 days by sea, and now you can do it in 15 days by land, by train. So, but that's maybe a bad sequencing, if you will, reactive. But I think it just illustrates that once you have created a more connected transcontinental cross-border large-scale rail system, naturally many companies will benefit. Even Japanese companies, Korean companies who are making products in coastal cities in China, and now they can ship those parts and components directly by train to Xi'an or to Chengdu, and then they can go further west to Europe. So the East Asia, interior China, Europe connection now has been forged, instead of, all go by sea, a long way, roundabout way getting to Europe.
All right, there was a question here and then in the back.
Thank you. It was one aspect that I kind of missed from your discussion, and that was the more like the political aspect of BRI and how China maybe wanted to use it to change the perception of China in the world and increase its sphere of influence, and also whether there is a kind of mismatch between the expectations that was given through this political project and what actually materialized. And maybe it's because of the more focus on private enterprise and the interest of private companies, but I wanted to put the conversation closer to home, because as you know, there's also talk about the Arctic Silk Way or something in that direction, And there were created a lot of expectations in places like northern Iceland, in Kirkenes, in Narvik, and it all turned out to be mirages. Nothing really has happened there. And a related issue, the 17+1 initiative, that is also kind of just collapsed in many ways. Maybe you could, I would be interested to hear your comments on that.
All right, we'll take one more question before we go into that very big question.
Thank you. You mentioned that the most of the investments was involved with the transportation and energy. And I have a question about the current situation when the West want to get out of Russian oil and gas, and China wants all this oil and gas and more. Whether you see that the situation will push up in time more Chinese involvement in Russian oil and gas, building pipelines from different parts of Siberia, or enhancing the LNG terminal in Yamal, and that China will use this opportunity to also to influence Russia more and get the energy at the same time. Thank you.
All right, I think those are questions for all of you or all of us. So the first one is about the political dimensions, ambitions, expectations versus materialization, and the other one about energy supplies and potential closer connections and more use of Russian energy sources from the Chinese side because of the Western sanctions. So who wants to jump in first?
I'll jump in first and go only for the first one.
All right.
And
so no oil for you?
No oil for me.
I'll take oil.
Yeah.
All right.
You can take that one.
So, and my research group has actually studied how some of these big political headlines or projects are launched. And the way it often happens in China is that a lot of different terms, like the BRI, are thrown out, and then tested, and some are latched onto, and some are not. And in my opinion, and you might differ, the BRI is one such concept that there could have been other concepts that rose to the surface. And BRI was called One Belt, One Road, so it changed name both in Chinese and English also along the way. But there is, you mentioned this at the beginning of the talk, there is also, these things are partly an umbrella under which you create some very directed initiative, but it's also an umbrella under which you can do things that you were doing in any case and either fail or succeed. So a lot of projects or activity that would take place in any case then get this kind of label. And then doesn't mean that the label is not important. So what soft power is an example for China, that it's also a term that sort of came in accidentally in Chinese politics. And it only gained traction once Western countries were like, wow, China is really building its soft power. And then China responded with, yes, we are building our soft power. And from there, it became a term, a notion that had a potency in its own right. So with the Northern Silk Road, Silk Road, you said it was mentioned, I think we shouldn't attach too much importance to whether it's called a Silk Road or whatever term is used. And these terms might be attached onto these northern initiatives as a trial balloon, and it might stick or it might burn out. But in any case, it doesn't tell you anything about whether this initiative is strongly supported or not. Yeah.
I'm sure there's more to say about both these questions,
Maybe I can just quickly add to Kathy. I would say the Belt and Road Initiative, certainly the more recent version or phase of it, I think has only reinforces China's very strong desire to create stronger and stronger economic, political, diplomatic relationship with the developing country, the developing world, as a way of, again, countering the growing rivalry and competition with the West. It has been doing that all along, even going back to the Maoist days, but it was under a very different ideological framework, ideological labeling, third world, non-aligned, foreign aid, assistance, and now have become, obviously much more commercial. Some they want to also make money, right? So, but using very different kind of strategy. I think the BRI has really provided China with a set of tools and instruments to continue to advance the what China perceives a very strong, connected, and shared interest and background and history with the developing countries. I would say particularly in Africa. So I think very political in that sense. But whether that's going to meet all the higher and higher expectations from the hosting, receiving countries is another matter, because if you're China suddenly going to scale down the financing for those countries, and there's one projection that shows for a number of countries, maybe a dozen countries in Africa and Asia, by 2025, they will be short by 47 billion in financing because the promised early financing suddenly stopped, right? So that means that expectation will be unmet. But very quickly on the Russian, recent example illustrates China's continued focus on oil and gas is actually rapidly growing investment in energy in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq. And again, that I think illustrates China's almost insatiable desire for oil and gas. Yes, I think now they're talking about building another pipeline to the east, Russia and China. Of course, the oil and gas pipeline from Myanmar, through into Kunming, Yunnan South, the more the better, right? In addition to the 3 lines already running from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan into Xinjiang. So the only major increase in recent BRI investment, with all the other areas have been reducing, is Middle East and oil and gas.
All right. Then I think that's a good time to end. Our time is, or did you have a...
Okay.
No.
One quick addendum to this, I guess.
I misread Rand's signals. I thought it was,
I just on the alternative side, again, if we think about the oil and gas landscape after the war in Ukraine and the consideration of China potentially having more access to LNG projects also on the Russian side, this has been a major concern from the Japan case, right? And this is why Japan has not actually sanctioned Russian oil and gas quite yet. I think that is something that will still be up for discussion, but one of the main arguments for not doing that is the potential then that will give Chinese entities access to cheaper options, LNG, very close by in Russia, and will again challenge the market. So another inland there, but I think of course the Myanmar case and the projects underway are also really important to consider in the future. Thanks.
Okay, that is a good place to end on that final point. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you all for Xiangming and Heidi and Ren for joining us. We will for sure keep discussing these issues amongst ourselves, and I'm sure we will have similar events here at NUPI. You're all cordially invited back anytime. Go out and enjoy hopefully the sun that has come up or the rain that is still dripping. We don't know. So thanks for now and see you later.